All right, it looks like we've got a critical mass, so let's just jump in if that's all right, Crystal. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Nate Denny. I'm the Deputy Secretary of NCDIT's Division of Broadband and Digital Equity, which is charged with implementing Governor Cooper's plan to close the digital divide in North Carolina. This is our kickoff webinar for what will be a pretty intensive planning process for North Carolina to start realizing the investments available to it through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Particularly, it's two programs for broadband infrastructure deployment and digital equity. The digital equity one has a simple name, Digital Equity Programs. On the broadband infrastructure side, it's the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD. We will try to avoid acronyms today, but being government, we will probably fail at that. So if you hear us say BEAD, that's what we mean. Today, we're going to walk through some of those different programs. I'm going to have a couple of our team members here, Emily Ganji, who is our policy director here in the division, and Maggie Woods, who's a program manager for our Office of Digital Equity and Literacy, walk you through those two programs, the planning processes that the state has to go through, and most importantly, how you as stakeholders and members of communities across North Carolina can participate and help shape the state's planning around those programs. We like to say, of course, between the American Rescue Plan funding that the state has, that the governor and the General Assembly have directed to this program, and now the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to close the digital divide in a pretty broad, comprehensive way in North Carolina. And the state government, in this case, the state's IT department that's a part of Governor Cooper's cabinet, has the funding and the programs in place. But when it comes to broadband infrastructure and really building digital equity, we need local leadership if we're going to succeed. So we can't do this alone, and we need all of you to be active participants through that process. So we'll walk you through a couple of different elements of the process and your opportunities to help guide it. And then we'll have time at the end for questions here today and tell you how to get questions answered beyond today's session. Next slide, please, Crystal. Again, I want to start with Governor Cooper's mission statement here for us. I think early in the pandemic, the governor recognized that we had a huge opportunity with the American Rescue Plan to close the digital divide once and for all in North Carolina. North Carolina received about $5.5 billion in state fiscal recovery funds through that American Rescue Plan. And the governor and the General Assembly have dedicated more than $1 billion in funding from that pot to addressing this problem. So when we talk about closing the digital divide, we talk about solving several distinct problems. One is the access to the infrastructure, right? Do you have a high-speed internet connection at the speed and quality needed to really participate in the modern economy? Then can you afford the service? Do you have access to the devices? Do you have the skills needed to really be competitive in this modern era? So our goal is to address each of those overlapping problems to help build that state of digital equity in North Carolina. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means coming up. Next slide, please. In the context of that American Rescue Plan funding, the governor set out very ambitious goals for us. By 2025, we want 98% of North Carolina households to have access to a high-speed internet connection. And when I say high-speed internet, I don't just mean what the FCC calls broadband today. Broadband is a term of art that specifically refers to internet in speeds of at least 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. You'll hear us in shorthand say 25.3 pretty often. That's what we're talking about. But 25.3 isn't enough for what we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly navigating the pandemic. If you have multiple parents working from home, children learning from home, folks trying to access telemedicine services or apply for jobs or access government benefits or programs, you need much higher speeds than that. And so with our American Rescue Plan resources, and now with the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment and Digital Equity programs, any infrastructure that we're deploying will have to hit a speed minimum of 100 megabits per second download, 20 megabits per second upload. So that's what we mean when we say high speed. We want an 80% statewide subscription average, right? We don't just want people to have access to the technology, we want them actively using it. And we don't just want an 80% average across the state. We want to make sure that demographic groups across North Carolina all have a chance to benefit from these historic investments. Right now in North Carolina, white households subscribe at a rate of about 76%. Black, Latino, and Native American households all lag considerably behind that. So we want to make sure we're putting the work in to make those services available and educate folks on how to access them, make sure they've got the devices they need. I think most importantly, we want a 100% subscription rate for households with school children in them, closing once and for all what's known as the homework gap, where children get assignments that require a high-speed internet connection that they don't have at home, and thus they fall behind their classmates. I think we've got the resources now between the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law to close that gap permanently. Next slide, please. Again, I've mentioned the American Rescue Plan and the $1 billion of funding that the governor and the General Assembly have directed to this problem or these problems already. But today we're focusing on what's next, right? Of the billion we've already received, our division has awarded about 28% of it, issuing great grant awards that will connect 113,000 homes and businesses across the state in 93 counties. We're just getting started. There's a lot more to do with that funding. But again, we're planning for how to maximize North Carolina's share of additional funding opportunities that are coming down the road. So the bipartisan infrastructure law set aside about $65 billion to close the digital divide across the country and make sure everyone has the internet and knows how to use it. A big chunk of that funding went to expanding the Affordable Connectivity Program, a $30 a month subsidy. But the bulk of the funding went to these grant programs that we're talking about today. The biggest single line item here is the $42 billion Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program that I mentioned, BEAD. What we'll talk through today is how we develop a 5-year plan that supports accessing a huge chunk of these funds. We believe North Carolina is going to have access to more than $1 billion for this problem through the BEAD program. Other programs we'll focus on today, highlighted below, the State Digital Equity Planning Grant Program, which North Carolina's already drawn down $1.4 million to help design that 5-year plan that will then support our accessing a share of a $1.44 billion pot that will be divided up on a formula basis by state. We think this will be in the $25 to $30 million range. And of course, there will be a subsequent program, the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. We won't talk about today, but it's important because the state won't be eligible to access those funds. So we've got to make sure that everything we're doing through the Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program is really investing in an ecosystem for digital equity and make sure that all of you, your counties, your municipal governments, local nonprofits, libraries, other entities are as competitive as possible to bring these funds back to North Carolina. Next slide, please. I mentioned already that DIT and the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity has accessed the planning funds for both of these programs, the $1.4 million in planning for the Digital Equity Program and $5 million for the BEAD program from NTIA, or the National Telecommunication and Information Administration, which is part of the Federal Department of Commerce. as we have to use those funds to develop 5-year plans that enable the state to pull down the rest of the funding. As we go through that planning process, the most important message we've received from our federal partners is we have to thoroughly, vigorously engage our stakeholders and make sure that we're not just designing a plan and throwing it back to the feds, that we've incorporated local expertise as we've developed it. We've heard very directly from NTI leadership that if we build a 5-year plan and they come back to the state and find out that our county commissioners, our League of Municipalities, our other critical partners haven't had a chance to participate in those planning processes, that plan will not be accepted. And so this seminar today is the first of about 10 listening sessions and engagements we'll have statewide that will inform that 5-year plan. And as it mentions here in the third bullet, we'll be incorporating that feedback in both the BEAD and digital equity plans, and again, use your expertise, your feedback to guide the use of those funds. Next slide, please. And again, why are we doing this, right? We're doing this because we have seen how urgent the problem is. I mentioned at the front end, the pandemic laid bare a lot of critical challenges locally across the state. Folks, it's more apparent than ever that you have to have access to the connection and the devices, skills. You have to be able to afford to use it if you want to participate in the modern economy. Our American Rescue Plan target is 98% access to a high-speed internet connection. We'll be using the BEAD and digital equity funds to get those numbers to 100%. The federal government tagline for these programs is Internet for All, and we want to make that a reality for every North Carolinian. If any of you had a chance to listen to Governor Cooper's State of the State last night, he was very clear. Between American Rescue Plan and bipartisan infrastructure law, we will use more than $2 billion to make sure every North Carolinian has the tools they need to participate and compete today. So again, we have to have your feedback, your guidance to build plans that will be that will make that successful. Next slide. And then more specifically, here's what we want to achieve through today's webinar and our subsequent engagements here with stakeholders, right? We want to make sure that we're building the communication channels and the muscle memory, frankly, to both solicit, receive, and incorporate your feedback and make sure that our plans represent all North Carolinians and all North Carolina communities. We want to take the investments we're making across infrastructure and across digital equity and make sure that they're producing measurable results that benefit everyone. And I think where we need local stakeholder support the most is right-sizing our maps. And I think Emily will talk about this a little bit more, but making sure that since you know your communities and you know your stakeholders, making sure that information is flowing back to the state and thus to the federal government about getting a more granular, correct view of who's served, who's unserved, who's underserved across the state. And then, of course, not just who has access to that infrastructure, but how we map true equity, how we understand how the availability or lack thereof of service affects communities across the state. Next slide. So with that, I want to hand it off to our policy director, Emily Ganji, who will walk you through specifically the BEAD planning process and what we need from you and what we can make available as we go into that process. Emily?
Thank you, Nate. I'm Emily Ganji, and as Nate said, I'm the policy director for the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. And it's a pleasure to be with you all virtually this afternoon. And we're excited about getting out around the state and being with you in several locations around the state to hear more from you as well as through these virtual options. A couple of things I want to mention before I get into more content. One, if you've got questions about anything Nate said or that I say or Maggie says throughout the webinar today, please put those questions in the Q&A feature. You should have a little button with a question mark in the bottom right of your screen. And if you click on that, it'll pull up the Q&A. We're going to have time at the end to answer your questions. And so please go ahead and drop those in anytime they come to mind during the session, and we'll make sure to answer them. Excuse me. It's spring in North Carolina, so my allergies are kicking in. The second point I wanted to make is that these slides and a recording of our webinar today will be posted on our website after the webinar. So you'll be able to go back and look at the slides or share the recording with other folks in your community or your organization who weren't able to join us today. So I'm the project director for the BEAD section of this strategic planning, broadband equity access and deployment. And Maggie Woods, who you'll hear from in just a bit, is the project director for the digital equity component of the strategic planning. And Maggie and I are spending a lot of time together and working hand in hand with other folks on our team in the division and a lot of stakeholders around the state to make sure that these two pieces of the strategic planning are really really aligned and working together in synergy. So Crystal, if you go to the next slide, please. So Nate mentioned that the estimates that we've seen are that North Carolina will receive between $800 million and $1.2 billion in implementation funding for BEAD from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so I wanted to spend a little time explaining to you what some of the eligible uses of that funding will be. The first, of course, is infrastructure for homes and businesses to get them connected and for them to have access to the internet. It can also be used to fund upgrades and infrastructure for community anchor institutions. And then, as Nate mentioned, we can also use the funding for mapping and data collection. So we've been doing a lot of work around mapping and then working with the FCC to improve their mapping and make sure that all the locations in North Carolina are reflected on those maps and that the data is accurate about which locations are served or underserved and would therefore be eligible for BEAD funding. It can also be used for wireless infrastructure, so to put Wi-Fi in multifamily residential buildings. It can be used to help with broadband adoption, so making sure that not only do homes and businesses have access to the internet, but that they're adopting the internet and subscribing, and helping the folks know about the Affordable Connectivity Program and the benefits that they may be eligible for to reduce the cost of their internet subscription. It can be used for training and workforce development. So as we invest this approximately $2 billion in our state, it's going to create a lot of jobs to deploy that infrastructure and also to maintain it. And so making sure we have the workforce in our state who are trained and capable of doing that work, and that those are good jobs that are available for them into the future. It can also be used for digital equity programs, which Maggie will speak to more, but there's some examples there of what those digital equity programs may look like. It can be used for education for individuals who are incarcerated. It can be used for digital navigators to help folks navigate the barriers that may be keeping them from achieving digital equity and making full use of the internet and the benefits to them for education and healthcare and economically. And then finally, it can be used for direct subsidies for internet subscription. Next slide, please. So the BEAD timeline is stretches out for 5 years, but we wanted to give you a snapshot of some major upcoming points in time. So you'll see there that we were awarded the planning funds from NTIA in November of last year. And so since that time, we've been really focused on designing what this planning process is going to look like for our state. And so from January until June of this year, we're going to be doing a lot of engaging with stakeholders around our state, both through virtual options like this webinar. We're going to do a series of these webinars quarterly to keep folks up to date who may not be able to join us in person. But we're also going to have a lot of local coordination events. We're going to host regional sessions in each of the state's 8 prosperity regions as defined by the General Assembly. And we're going to do some listening sessions with target populations, priority populations around the state as well. We've also been coordinating a great deal with the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners and the North Carolina Rural Center and the North Carolina League of Municipalities, and involving them in all of our planning and design. We're going to spend a lot of time doing a needs assessment and an asset inventory and figuring out where the gaps are between those two, to help us identify the strategies that should be part of our strategic plan for the next 5 years for both infrastructure and digital equity. NTIA has said that they expect to release the allocations for each state for implementation funding by June 30th of this year. And so we'll know more at that time. We'll also be posting a draft of our BEAD plan in June for public comment. You'll have at least 30 days to provide comments on that draft before we submit the final version to NTIA in July, when it's due at the end of that month. Then in approximately December, we'll submit our initial proposal to NTIA, which will include a workforce plan, in addition to several other items, but I wanted to flag that since workforce is such a big issue in our state. And then in 2024, at some point, we'll get approximately 20% of the implementation funding from NTIA, and we'll be doing a challenge process, running a challenge process regarding the mapping, where folks can provide input to make sure that our mapping is as accurate as possible. And we'll be doing a subgrantee selection process in 2024 to identify the subrecipients who will get grants administered through our division of those BEAD funds. And then in 2025, we'll submit our final proposal to NTIA, which is where we'll report on how that initial implementation went with the first approximately 20% of funding, and talk about what we're going to do with the remaining 80%, and basically talk about lessons learned and what we're going to do to refine the process going forward. Next slide, please, Crystal. So now I'm going to turn it over to Maggie to talk more about the digital equity planning. And do remember to keep putting your questions in the Q&A. It's been good to see some coming in, and we'll get to those in just a bit. Maggie?
Thanks, Emily, and hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you this afternoon. I'm Maggie Woods. I'm a digital equity manager with the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy. And while you're hearing from me today, we have a fantastic digital equity team. So we have Annette Taylor, our director, and Kaya Edwards, who I know is also attending today. She's another digital equity manager. And so you're hearing from me today, but please know that along with working closely with Emily, there's a team of us ensuring that we're making North Carolina the most digitally equitable state in the country. So let's move on to the next slide. And I want to just set the stage by first defining a couple terms, because many of you may have been in this conversation around broadband infrastructure for a long time, but the term digital equity and digital inclusion is still fairly new, though you may have been doing this work for years. So when we say digital equity, we mean that all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. So this is the goal. This is what we are working towards every single day. It's what our broadband infrastructure colleagues are working towards every single day. But the way we get there is through digital inclusion. And digital inclusion has 5 main elements. The first is access to affordable, high-speed internet. Affordable being the key word there, because if you cannot afford the internet, even if you have the physical access to it, you aren't reaping the benefits and the opportunities that the internet has to offer. The second is you need access to a device that meets your needs. So we typically mean a computer, laptop, or tablet. We typically don't mean a smartphone when we talk about a device that meets your needs, unless we're working with specific populations. But as we all learned during the pandemic, it's really hard to do your work on a smartphone. It's really hard to do your homework on a smartphone, though many people have had to do that and still continue to do that. The third is you must have access to digital literacy skills or digital literacy training. So do you know how to use that device that you have? Do you know how to connect to the internet? And digital literacy, of course, is a spectrum, right? There's basic digital literacy. Can you turn on a computer? Can you access your email? But there's also, digital literacy. Do you know how to use Excel? Do you know how to use specific software programs? Do you know how to code? So the more we move along the digital literacy or digital skills spectrum, the more we're able to move up the workforce ladder. So that's a really key element to digital inclusion. The fourth element is access to quality technical support. And this is one that often gets overlooked, but what happens if your computer breaks? Who can you go to get it fixed? Is it exorbitantly expensive? So we need to ensure that North Carolinians have access to tech support so that if something happens to their computer, which it will, they're able to get it fixed and get back on track. And then finally, and this is a little bit more macro, but we want to ensure that applications and online content are designed to enable and encourage use, right? We want to ensure that government websites are accessible to people with disabilities, that are accessible for people who may not have English as their first language. We want to ensure that online content is easy for people to use. So that's what we mean when we're talking about digital equity and digital inclusion. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about what we're planning to do. So as Emily mentioned, we are embarking on a year-long state digital equity planning process. And this is going to set the priorities for the next 5 years. And I mentioned my team members who are part of this process, but I do also want to mention that we have a team, we call them the core planning team, of 10 key partners around the state who are helping us ensure that we're meeting all of the requirements of the digital equity plan and that we are keeping equity at the center and ensuring that we are incorporating the voices of people across North Carolina. So what will we have in the plan? Well, as identified by law, we need to identify what the barriers to digital equity are, both for the general population as well as for specific covered populations. And I'll talk through who those covered populations are in a moment. And in order to identify these barriers, we are hosting listening sessions. We are partnering with trusted community partners across the state to do these listening sessions with covered populations. As Emily mentioned, we'll also be hosting regional convenings in the 8 economic prosperity zones. So this will be a part of both BEAD and digital equity planning. We're also deploying the first ever digital equity survey in the state. You may know that we have a broadband access survey, but we'll also be deploying a digital equity survey, and that'll be deployed via mail and paper, as well as online and phone, so that we're capturing people no matter where they are or who they are in the state. And all of this will help us develop a data baseline. So what are the key barriers to digital equity in North Carolina? So we have a good place to start. And once we have that data baseline, then we'll be working on how do we overcome those barriers, right? How do we meet the needs of people in North Carolina? And so our plan will have those measurable objectives for how to meet those needs. We'll also be developing an asset inventory, much like the BEAD plan. But our asset inventory will be ensuring that we are mapping all of the digital equity resources in the state. So where can you go if you want to access a free or low-cost computer? Where can you go if you want to take some basic digital literacy classes? Where can you go if you need technical support for your computer? And so our plan is to have this actually, you can search for it. I'm in Anson County and I'm looking for a free or low-cost computer, and you can actually find where to go to get that's closest to you. So we hope that this will be a key resource for people across the state to meet their digital needs. We're also going to be integrating all local digital inclusion plans into our statewide plan. So you may or may not be aware, but there are 40 counties that have a digital inclusion plan at the local level, whether it's through their county or through their region. And we know that tremendous time, energy, effort has gone into creating these local plans. And you're able to get into details that we can't get into at the state. So we are working to ensure that those plans are integrated into our state goals and into this state plan. And then finally, we'll be working closely with state agencies to ensure that our plan corresponds with plans from Department of Public Instruction, with plans from Department of Commerce, et cetera, so that we are working in tandem together and not working separately. Moving on to the next slide. So I just want to show you a timeline, much like Emily showed the timeline for BEAD, so what to expect. So in November 2021, the Digital Equity Act was passed. That's the funding that provided for these planning funds. We were awarded our planning funds in November. We have 1 year to complete this plan. And so between now and August, we'll be hosting those listening sessions. We'll be doing that asset inventory, supporting that local coordination to make sure that we are identifying the real needs that exist in North Carolina. We will have a draft plan available for public comment in September, and we will then finalize that plan and submit it by October. The next spring, so spring 2024, we're looking a year out, we will as a state then be able to apply for and draw down funds to implement those plans. And so I believe Nate talked about that. We expect it to be about $25 million to ensure that we can implement this plan that we've put together, so it doesn't just sit on a website somewhere. And then finally, and I want to note this because it's really important to all of you on the call, is that in fall 2024, there will be national competitive grants that are open for anyone who isn't a state, right? So nonprofits, local governments, higher education institutions, to apply for digital equity funding to develop or expand digital equity programs on the ground. So our goal is to do as much as possible and to build the capacity in communities across North Carolina so that as many North Carolinians can take advantage of that competitive grant when that launches in fall 2024. So moving on to the next slide. I just wanted to note that both of these planning processes are for everyone. They're all for all North Carolinians, but with a special focus on these 10 covered populations. So these are the 10 covered populations identified by the federal government as being those who have been been on the wrong end of the digital divide, have been the most digitally excluded. So this includes aging individuals, immigrants, individuals who live in households at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, individuals with disabilities, individuals with a language barrier, individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, individuals who primarily reside in a rural area, incarcerated individuals, LGBTQI people, and veterans. Moving on to the next slide. So I'm now going to pass this back to Emily to talk about ways that you can share input on both of these planning efforts.
Thank you, Maggie. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the first of a series of webinars. We plan to offer one of these quarterly to update you on where we are and give you a chance to ask questions and provide input. We're also going to host 8 regional sessions around the state, in each of the state's 8 prosperity zones as defined by the General Assembly. And we'll be posting the dates and locations of those on the website and also sending that out by email next week. You'll be able to sign up on our website if you want to be on an email list so that you'll get updates whenever we send out new information or there are new documents available on the website. If you want us to alert you instead of having to go check it out periodically and see what's new there. As Maggie mentioned, we'll also be doing listening sessions with partner organizations who either are associations or who represent the folks who identify as those covered populations that Maggie just spoke about. If you're part of an organization who would be interested in helping us host some of those listening sessions, please reach out to us. You can reach out to us at broadband@nc.gov, or you can also reach out to Maggie or me directly to let us know that. We've also mentioned that we have our existing broadband survey that folks have been completing for a couple of years now. We're refining that survey so that's an opportunity for folks to let us know what sort of access and service they have at their home or business. If they have the internet, they can do a quick speed test that will let us know their location and what speeds are available at their location. If folks don't have the internet, there's a telephone number that they can call to complete the survey instead, because we want it to be accessible for those who don't have internet service to be able to complete the survey. And that information is all on our website as well. We're also coordinating with a lot of other state agencies and local agencies with this plan. There are some other key state agencies like Commerce and Education and Adult Corrections and folks who in Health and Human Services who have programming that relates a great deal to this plan, and who we partner with on things like internet access for education to overcome the homework gap, and with telehealth and with workforce training and economic development. And so we'll be coordinating with all those folks over the next year as we develop these plans as well. And then in May, we're going to have a summit event that we're co-hosting with NTIA as a local coordination event, where we'll be sharing what we've learned from all this listening and all this research that we're doing and data that we're collecting with stakeholders from around the state, and getting your feedback and input about how all that we've learned from all this listening and data should be used to inform the plan and the strategies that are identified in that plan for the next 5 years. As I've mentioned before, so the division's website is ncbroadband.gov. If you want to get directly to the page about this strategic planning effort, just add BEAD at the end of that and you'll be able to get to us quickly. Next slide, please, Crystal. I think I covered most of this on the last slide. Oops. So these are some more specific dates. So we'll be doing a lot of listening from March to June. There's the dates there, May 23rd for the summit that we're planning to share with stakeholders what we've learned and get additional feedback to inform the strategies in the plan. We'll plan to host the next webinar like this one in June to provide an update on where things are and get additional input from you and answer questions you may have. We'll post the draft BEAD plan for public comment in June, so you'll have at least 30 days to take a look at that draft and give us feedback that we'll be able to incorporate before the final version, not draft, is due to NTIA in July. We're planning to have the third webinar in August to give you an update. So at that point, we will have submitted the plan to NTIA, and we'll be getting farther along with the digital equity plan and be able to share more with you about that one. The digital equity plan draft will be posted for public comment in September. By September, it might be done before that. If Maggie might get it done faster than that. And then it's due to NTIA by October 30th. And then we'll have another webinar toward the end of the year in November to update you again on what's been submitted and where things are and what the next steps look like. So I believe that's the end of our content, and we'll move now to questions. So if you haven't already, we've had a lot of questions come in, which is great. But if you haven't yet, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can this afternoon. We've got about 20 minutes left. Also wanted to mention that if something comes up after this session, we're going to have a form on our website where you can submit a question through an online form. We're still testing that function. You know, we're in the IT department, so we have to be really careful about how we use technology and forms. So it's not quite ready yet. So in the meantime, you'll be able to email us. The email address is on our website as well. So you can email questions to us, and we'll be glad to hear from you. Crystal is going to moderate the question. So Crystal, you want to pose the first one?
Absolutely. Thanks, Emily. I'm Crystal Dickerson. I'm the Communications Manager for the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. Our first question comes in with, how will NCDIT work with unions going forward to help resolve some of the workforce issues here in North Carolina?
Thanks, Crystal. I'll take that one on, and thanks to Mr. Busby for asking as well. I think that unions are an absolutely critical part of our overall stakeholder picture here. I think that CWA in particular has been very engaged in questions of how North Carolina prepares a workforce that can help execute on these projects, right? We are making $1 billion or $2 billion worth of infrastructure deployment. That's a lot of work, right? There's a lot of labor that comes with that. And my hope is that CWA and other unions with a North Carolina presence will be active partners throughout all of these listening sessions, right? Emily ran through a very full calendar of opportunities to provide feedback, and we hope that you'll be at the table for all of those. And the workforce issues, of course, aren't just tied to how we get the infrastructure deployed. Workforce itself is one of the critical deliverables for both building a state of digital equity and for these programs in particular, right? Both BEAD and digital equity require a workforce planning component. And my hope is that organized labor will be at the table for all of that.
Thanks, Nate. Our next question is for Emily. What are some early on challenges that have been identified for the state when it comes to implementation, mapping, or others?
So mapping was one element, so I'll address that one first. So the FCC released their new mapping tool in this year, and we had a quick timeline to be able to engage folks around the state to challenge that mapping data. So the quick turnaround over the holidays was one of the initial challenges of getting folks, letting folks know that that opportunity was available, that the maps had been posted, and that in order for them to challenge the data that was available on those maps in time for it to have an impact on the state's BEAD implementation funding was a challenge. I'd say it continues the map will continue to be updated every 6 months or so based on data that providers submit to FCC and the challenges that residents and organizations like ours, state broadband divisions or offices, submit to those maps. So that'll be an ongoing challenging component of our work, is trying to refine those maps and make them as accurate as possible. I would say another challenge has been uniform guidance, the federal regulations, and making sure that the provisions of that guidance are suitable for the programs that we have in North Carolina and the legislative environment that we have, where the bulk of our infrastructure is provided by private internet service providers or cooperatives, as opposed to by state or local government. And so navigating those legal waters and those federal regulations with our state statutes has been challenging and taken a great deal of time as well. So those are just two. I'll leave it there to not take up the rest of the time.
Emily, can I chime in with another one?
Sure.
Just keep throwing lots of challenges. I think another one that we have been thinking through and would like to help address, but I think need more feedback on, is local capacity. I think when you talk with our partners, particularly at the county government level, because on the infrastructure side, counties have a role as a potential partner in several of our different programs that we're using to incentivize infrastructure deployment. You deal with a wide range of kind of personnel capacity, full-time attention, and technical expertise, depending on where you're going, right? There are small rural counties with extremely limited staffing, trying to figure out how to navigate all these federal programs, handle the kind of the GIS work for mapping, right? The grant management, the federal compliance. There's so many different needs just around making one of these projects work, particularly where counties are chipping in as a partner, either with funding or with existing infrastructure they're making available to a provider. And what we've seen in the work we're doing implementing our American Rescue Plan funding, particularly through the Great Grant Awards, is there's a severe need at the local level for expertise and for capacity. So our focus in trying to face that is really make sure that our programs, our grant agreements, our memorandums of understanding, and our guidance are all geared toward making things as easy as possible for counties to navigate. And so I would ask all of you on this call who are seeing kind of the end result that we're pushing out, or the draft guidance and other things we're making available, hold us accountable to that standard, right? Make sure that we are being deliberate in how we communicate and how we design our programs so that local capacity isn't a barrier to entry.
Thanks, Nate. We have one more question for you. How is the state managing through laws large internet service providers to ensure equity and competition within the state?
A few different thoughts on that. One, I think we need to be upfront about the fact that our office, the Division of Broadband Infrastructure, the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity, with both the Broadband Infrastructure Office and the Digital Equity team, have way more carrots than sticks, right? We've got several billion carrots and 0 sticks. We don't have a regulatory role. And what we've tried to do is make sure that our programs, our funding streams have strings attached to them, right? So an example that I'll use is the protest process in the Great Grant application. So right now, any provider that serves North Carolina locations may protest another applicant that proposes to serve locations that are already served by the protesting entity. I didn't word that super clearly, but you can basically say, don't fund Maggie because Emily's already got that area covered, right? We have, in partnership with the legislature, created guarantees that anyone participating in that process have to show us the actual locations where they're serving and the technology they're using to serve it, so that we can say, look, you can't just shoot down other projects. You can't just take pot shots at new infrastructure. You need to demonstrate that you're actually providing high-speed internet in that location. We've got a number of tools like that, and we're working on growing additional tools. I think as we move to the Completing Access to Broadband program in particular, where we are using a procurement approach to address or to build projects with a local community on a county-by-county basis, we'll be able to use the competitive procurement process to get additional information and reporting and accountability mechanisms built in with providers, but that's a work in progress.
Maggie, I have a question for you. Are there grants for devices?
Yes, that's a great question. So currently, as we talk about this planning effort, we know that one of the biggest barriers, or one of the biggest digital needs, is access to devices. So 430,000 North Carolina households don't have a home laptop or desktop computer. That's a problem. And so we know that through this planning process, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper about what kinds of devices are needed, who needs those devices, and we expect that some of the solutions raised in the plan will be to ensure that people have access to devices. I will also say our office currently has other funds that are going to be focused on devices. So even as we do this planning process, we will be rolling out programs to ensure that people have access to devices. So I would say stay tuned, but we are very, very aware of the need for devices.
Great. Okay, Emily, another question for you. Does the state plan to procure outside partnerships, consultants, et cetera, to work on this program, or do you plan to handle it all in-house?
We've got a draft request for proposals for strategic advisory services. We've spent some time during this planning and design phase figuring out what parts of this work we can handle in-house with our full-time staff and for which components we're going to need some additional help. So that draft is going through the approval process in the Department of Information Technology, but it will be released hopefully soon. And that will be something we can post on our website when that is available as well, to let folks know that that request for proposals for strategic advisory services is open for bids.
Thanks, Emily. Maggie, another question for you. How are you planning to include people with limited English proficiency during assessment?
Great question. So we have a number of strategies. One is ensuring that our materials, particularly our survey, is available in multiple languages. So not just English and Spanish, but we're working really closely with the governor's office to identify the 6 top languages spoken in North Carolina so that our survey can be deployed in all 6 of those languages. And then partnerships is key here, right? So partners who are willing to help us distribute that survey. Like I said, we'll have like printed out copies that people can mail back to us. So can we partner with you to make sure that you get X number of surveys that can be mailed back? Can we partner with you to ensure that the people that you serve have access to these surveys in the language that you need? And if you're seeing a language that you serve that we're not providing, please let us know. And then when we talked about these listening sessions, right, these are these small listening sessions that are specifically targeting those 10 covered populations. We are partnering with key community partners to host those listening sessions. And so these are partners who know the needs of the community, so can bring in the interpretation services as needed, or other kinds of wraparound services to ensure that participants are able to provide their feedback in the language that they speak best. But I'll say partnership is key, if you didn't hear me say it. And so we want to connect with you if you are working with a population that has specific, particularly language needs, and you want to be connected to us, please reach out and let's connect.
Great. You have a couple more questions on digital inclusion plans. The first one said, regarding existing digital inclusion plans, would you also include municipalities that have completed digital inclusion plans in the state's plan?
Yes. Yep. So counties, cities, towns, regions, any local digital inclusion plan we are incorporating into the state's planning efforts. If you're interested in learning more about digital inclusion plans that exist in the state, I recommend going to the Institute for Emerging Issues website. They have a program called BAND NC, and it has a whole goal of ensuring that all North Carolina counties have a digital inclusion plan in place. So we're working closely with them to ensure that we're pulling themes from all of the plans and pulling all the assets, because each planning process had to do an asset inventory. So pulling all those assets and resources, so that's incorporated into our state plan.
Would someone be able to find out more details about the 40 out of 50 counties having digital inclusion plans on that site?
Yep. There's a link on the Institute for Emerging Issues website. It has an interactive map that shows where the plans are completed, where they're in progress, and for the completed plans, it has links to those plans. I'm not sure if all 40 are included and completed, because last week a big chunk of regions finished their digital inclusion plan, so I'm not sure if they're up on the website yet. But I bet you if you reached out to them, they could give you some more information if you're not seeing what you want on the website.
Great. One more question. What process is being used to identify asset inventory?
Yeah, so we are partnering with 2 fantastic university systems to develop our asset inventory, and they're taking a multi-pronged approach. So they are surveying like existing anchor institutions or existing organizations that we know are already providing digital inclusion, digital equity assets. So libraries, for instance, that have been on the front line of the digital divide, or community colleges, workforce development centers. So they're going to start by surveying what we know, and collecting very specific assets. But they're also bringing on a pretty phenomenal team of people to do a lot of just like the asset inventory grunt work. It's exciting. I don't actually want to call it grunt work, but the calling up people, looking at websites, trying to find out where, what might be published. So just like the people power to ensure that we're collecting all of these resources. And then they're doing a double check. They're actually going to do interviews and conversations with people across the state to, one, see are there assets that we don't know about? The answer is probably yes. And then two, are those assets meeting your needs? So it's kind of a second check to see what is missing throughout this process. And then ultimately that will be put on an interactive website so that you can, search for the asset that you're looking for, the resource that you're looking for, where you live, and find that information. So to me, this asset inventory is just like the linchpin to everything that we are doing.
Okay, one more, Maggie. Will there be funding available like Band NC for various levels of local governments to develop plans for both BEAD and digital equity?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. So we have recently, through our interagency digital equity grant program, so separate from this planning process, but a grant program, we funded the Institute to ensure that all counties have digital equity plans, so at the county level. In terms of towns or municipalities, let's talk. Let's have a conversation about that. I don't know the answer, but I can tell you that within the next year and a half, every single North Carolina county will have a digital equity plan in place. And those with a digital equity plan, no matter if you're at the county, town, municipal level, can apply for our Digital Champion grant program that's coming up this year to help implement that plan. So I'd say if your county has a plan and you're a town within that county, you could definitely apply to implement the plan. But I'd be happy to talk to you more specifics on your question.
And Crystal, if I could add to that one from the infrastructure side, the division will also be launching the Completing Access to Broadband program this year, which is a program where internet service providers will be pre-qualified to submit bids for projects that the counties produce. So each county will have an opportunity to create a scope of work for the locations in their county where they want to target internet service, and then we'll put those out to bid for internet service providers to bid on. And so folks on our team are providing a lot of technical assistance and support and mapping resources to help counties get ready to be able to submit those scopes of work, which will then be eligible for both state and local investment and private investment from the providers who bid on them.
Thanks, Emily. I have a follow-up for you on mapping. Is the map of the 8 prosperity zones on the digital broadband site?
It's not, but that's a good idea. We can add that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've had a lot of interest here in the comments about learning about how we'll host listening sessions and how we chose our partners for that. And if we could partner with broadband companies in developing these programs. Nate, Emily?
That was a lot of questions, Crystal. It's 3 o'clock and she's trying to get in as many as possible. I would say the regional sessions that will be in person in each of the 8 regions defined by the legislature, we're still reserving venues for those. We've tried to work with community anchor institutions to host those events, and we'll be sharing that information with you next week, as I mentioned. Maggie may want to say more about how folks can partner with us to host listening sessions to try to reach folks who identify as those covered populations.
Yeah, we're still looking to identify the community organizations to host these listening sessions. We'll be bringing in a facilitator to do the listening sessions, but like I mentioned, we need those deep community groups who can help us identify participants and physically host in a space and ensure that the listening session is appropriate to the population. And so if you're interested, I would love to talk to you about it. And we can figure out a way possibly to engage you and your organization.
I would just add that consider an answer to a lot of these questions is, I don't know, let's think about it. Let's talk about it, right? So Emily will share contact information for you to reach out with anything else. If you have ideas, certainly bring them to us. You know, we've only got so many folks thinking about and talking about this day to day, and we need those exact perspectives. So just assume the answer is, huh, that's interesting. Let's discuss, right? So just please keep in touch.
And as we are at our 3 o'clock time, that's a great way to wrap us up, Nate. Thank you for all the questions. We do have a few more in here. We will go through and respond back and add frequently asked questions to our website as well. As you can see, the website is there, ncbroadband.gov/BEAD. If you have any questions, and Emily and Maggie, if you want to provide some contact information as well. Other than what's on the website, is if there's any questions, would you like for them to reach out to directly to you?
Sure. My
Maybe-
email is, go ahead, Maggie.
Sorry. My email is Maggie, so MAGGIE .woods, WOODS @NC.gov.
And mine is Emily, EMILY .gangi, GANGI @NC.gov. We'll be glad to hear from you.
Perfect. Thank you all. We appreciate all of your time. We appreciate all the questions and all of the feedback and people asking how they can support this initiative. We are really looking forward to partnering with all of you.